Imagine waking up in the middle of the night with a pain so overwhelming, so relentless, that no position, no medication, no amount of desperate prayer can touch it. Your stomach is in open revolt. The nausea arrives in waves so powerful you can barely breathe between them. The room spins. You vomit until there is nothing left to give, and then your body demands more anyway. The emergency room doctors run every test they know. They scan, they probe, they draw blood, they shake their heads. Nothing. No explanation. And then, in the chaos of that fluorescent-lit nightmare, something strange happens. Someone wheels you toward a shower. The hot water hits your skin, and within minutes, sometimes seconds, the agony begins to recede. The nausea quiets. Your muscles unclench. You stand there, shaking, soaking, and you think, what just happened to me? For millions of people around the world, this is not a hypothetical. This is Tuesday. This is every few weeks. This is their life. The condition is called Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome, or CHS. And for a long time, almost nobody had heard of it. The doctors treating it were baffled by it. The patients suffering from it had no name for it. And the substance causing it, a plant that human beings have used for thousands of years, was the last thing anyone suspected. This is the story of one of modern medicine's most puzzling, most underreported, and most urgently relevant mysteries. A condition born in an era of changing laws, changing culture, and changing chemistry. A condition that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about something tens of millions of people believe to be harmless, or even healing. A condition that has sent people to emergency rooms hundreds of times before anyone connected the dots. A condition that, in many ways, we are only beginning to understand. This is the hot shower mystery. To understand why CHS matters so much right now, you have to understand the world it appeared in. Over the past 15 years, cannabis has undergone one of the most dramatic cultural and legal transformations of any substance in modern history. In 2010, 14 states in the United States had some form of medical marijuana law on the books. By 2024, that number had grown to 38 states with medical programs and 24 states where recreational adult use is fully legal. Globally, countries from Canada to Germany to Uruguay have moved toward legalization or decriminalization. The stigma that once surrounded cannabis use has, for many people, effectively evaporated. And the market has responded accordingly. The cannabis industry in the United States alone is now worth tens of billions of dollars annually. Dispensaries have replaced the shadowy transactions of the past with gleaming storefronts and product menus that read like craft beer selections. There are tinctures and edibles and topicals and vapes. There are concentrates so potent they bear almost no resemblance to anything a person might have encountered a generation ago. That last point is critical, and we will return to it. Because the cannabis of today is not the cannabis of the 1970s or even the 1990s. The plant has been selectively bred, engineered, and concentrated to levels that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of users. The average THC content of cannabis flower sold in legal dispensaries today can be 3 to 5 times higher than what circulated in previous decades. Concentrates can push that figure even higher. And when you change the dose so dramatically, you change the equation entirely. Into this landscape of expanding use and intensifying product, CHS arrived, or more accurately, arrived at our awareness. Because the condition itself almost certainly predates its formal identification. It was first described in the medical literature in 2004, by a team of physicians in Australia led by Dr. Alan Simonetto and his colleagues, who published a case series of patients presenting with a bizarre cluster of symptoms: cyclic vomiting, abdominal pain, and compulsive hot bathing. All of the patients were chronic, heavy cannabis users. All of them improved when they stopped using cannabis. The paper was careful, measured, and largely ignored. It would take years, and a rising tide of emergency room visits, before the medical community began to take serious notice. Part of what made CHS so difficult to identify, and so easy to dismiss, was that it defied everything medicine thought it knew about cannabis. Cannabinoids, the active compounds in the cannabis plant, were widely understood to be antiemetic, meaning they reduce nausea and vomiting. This was not controversial. It was settled science. In fact, synthetic cannabinoid medications had been developed and approved precisely because of this anti-nausea property. They were used to help cancer patients manage the brutal side effects of chemotherapy. The idea that cannabis could cause vomiting was, to many physicians, almost paradoxical. A logical contradiction. And when patients showed up in emergency rooms saying they used cannabis regularly and were suffering from uncontrollable vomiting, the cannabis was often the last thing anyone considered as the cause. Instead, patients were investigated for gastroparesis, for Crohn's disease, for cyclic vomiting syndrome unrelated to any external substance, for anxiety disorders, for rare metabolic conditions. Some were referred to psychiatrists. Some were told the vomiting was psychosomatic. Some underwent endoscopies, colonoscopies, CT scans, MRI studies, every invasive and expensive diagnostic tool available, and still received no answer. Meanwhile, those same patients had quietly discovered something remarkable entirely on their own. Hot showers helped. Not warm showers. Not baths, necessarily, though those sometimes work too. Scalding, steaming, almost unbearably hot showers. Patients were taking them multiple times a day, sometimes for hours at a stretch, running up water bills that strained their finances, draining their households of hot water, standing under the spray until their skin turned red and the nausea finally, mercifully, ebbed. And then they would get out, and within hours, sometimes minutes, it would start again. This compulsive hot water bathing behavior, physicians call it the learned bathing response, became one of the defining and most diagnostically useful features of CHS. But it was also, for a long time, one of the features that led doctors astray. Because bathing compulsively to relieve abdominal distress is also a known feature of a condition called psychogenic vomiting. And so the cycle of misdiagnosis continued. The human cost of this diagnostic delay is difficult to overstate. Interviews with CHS patients reveal stories of years spent in confusion and suffering. People who saw 5, 10, 15 different doctors without ever receiving a correct diagnosis. People who lost jobs because the episodes were so unpredictable and so debilitating. People who spent thousands of dollars on emergency room visits, on specialist consultations, on medications that did nothing, on procedures that solved nothing. People who were made to feel that they were inventing their symptoms, exaggerating their pain, or simply seeking drugs. And all the while, the one thing that would eventually be identified as the cause of their suffering, cannabis, was the thing many of them were using to cope with their symptoms, because the immediate effects of THC could temporarily blunt the nausea, before the cycle inevitably deepened. This is one of the cruelest ironies at the heart of CHS. The substance causing the disease can also, in the short term, feel like it is treating it. Patients self-medicate with cannabis because it provides fleeting relief, which keeps them in the cycle, which keeps the disease going. The trap is elegant in its viciousness. Today, emergency physicians in regions with high rates of cannabis use are seeing CHS patients with increasing frequency. Some urban emergency departments report that CHS now accounts for a significant and growing proportion of cyclic vomiting presentations. As cannabis becomes more legal, more available, and more potent, the condition is becoming more visible and more urgent. But visibility is not the same as understanding. Because even now, in 2024, the precise biological mechanism behind CHS remains incompletely understood. We know what triggers it. We know who is most vulnerable to it. We know how to stop it. But the question of why, of what is actually happening inside the body of a chronic cannabis user to produce this devastating syndrome, that question has led researchers into some of the most fascinating and unexpected corners of neuroscience, pharmacology, and human physiology. And the answers they are finding are stranger, and more significant, than almost anyone anticipated. To understand how we got here, how a plant used for millennia suddenly began producing a syndrome that medicine had never seen, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand what cannabis actually does inside the human body, and why, in some people and under some conditions, it begins to do something that looks nothing like what we expected. The story starts with a discovery that changed everything we thought we knew about the human brain. For years, the medical community was essentially flying blind. Patients would arrive in emergency rooms, doubled over in pain, vomiting so severely they couldn't keep water down, and the standard playbook simply didn't apply. Doctors would run the tests, check the blood work, scan for obstructions, and come back with nothing. Nothing that explained the severity of what these people were experiencing. And then something strange would happen. The patient would disappear, not from the hospital, but from the waiting area, from their bed, and a nurse would eventually find them crouched in the shower, scalding water running over their back, and for the first time in hours, maybe days, they would look almost peaceful. This was the moment that should have changed everything. And yet, for most of the medical establishment, it remained a curiosity rather than a clue. Emergency physicians are trained to treat what they can see, what they can measure. A patient who finds relief in a shower doesn't fit neatly into a diagnostic flowchart. So the notation would go into the chart, patient found bathing, appears to self-soothe, and the deeper question, the question of why hot water was doing what morphine couldn't, went largely unasked. That question, it turns out, is one of the most fascinating puzzles in modern toxicology. To understand what's happening in the body during a CHS episode, you have to go back to the basic science of the endocannabinoid system, a network of receptors threaded through the brain, the gut, and the skin that was only formally described in the early 1990s. For most of human history, we didn't even know this system existed. It was the study of cannabis itself that revealed it. Researchers, trying to understand how THC produced its effects, discovered that the brain wasn't just passively absorbing a foreign chemical. It had receptors perfectly shaped to receive it, which meant the body was already making something similar on its own. The endocannabinoid system regulates an almost bewildering range of functions: appetite, pain, mood, inflammation, nausea, body temperature. That last one is critical. Body temperature. Because one of the things that THC does when it enters the system is interact with temperature-regulating pathways in a very specific way. In moderate, occasional use, this interaction is subtle, almost imperceptible. But in heavy, chronic users, something begins to shift. Dr. Ethan Russo, a neurologist who has spent decades studying cannabinoids, has described it as a kind of pharmacological exhaustion. The receptors that normally maintain the body's thermal balance become dysregulated. The brain's hypothalamus, the region responsible for keeping your core temperature in its narrow, critical range, begins receiving contradictory signals. And in some individuals, after months or years of daily cannabis use, the system appears to invert. Instead of cannabis calming nausea, as it does in cancer patients receiving chemotherapy, it begins to cause it. Instead of reducing pain, it amplifies it. The very same compound that once brought relief becomes the source of the illness. This paradox, a medicine becoming a poison through repetition, is not unique to cannabis. It mirrors what happens with certain headache medications that, taken too frequently, begin to cause the headaches they were meant to prevent. It echoes the rebound effect seen with overuse of nasal decongestants. But with CHS, the mechanism is more complex, more layered, and still not fully understood. Here is what researchers believe is happening. The skin is rich in cannabinoid receptors, particularly a type called TRPV1 receptors, which are also activated by heat. These receptors, sometimes called the body's thermostat, play a role in how we perceive temperature and pain. THC interacts with TRPV1 receptors directly. And in a state of cannabinoid hyperemesis, where the gut is in crisis and the brain's regulatory systems are misfiring, the application of intense external heat appears to essentially override the distress signal. The hot water activates the same receptors through a different pathway, producing a temporary reset, not a cure, but a powerful interruption of the cycle that can last anywhere from 20 minutes to several hours. Think of it like a circuit breaker. The system is overwhelmed, the signals are crossed, and the heat essentially trips the switch, restoring just enough equilibrium that the patient can breathe, can stop vomiting, can feel, briefly, like themselves again. This explains why the behavior becomes compulsive. Patients have reported spending 4, 5, 6 hours a day in the shower. Some have drained their water heaters entirely. Some have burned themselves, sustaining real tissue damage, because they keep pushing the temperature higher as the effect becomes harder to achieve. In the language of addiction science, this is tolerance, the dose required to produce the same relief increasing over time. And that framing matters, because it reframes the shower behavior not as eccentricity, not as psychological disturbance, but as a physiological response to a physiological crisis. For a long time, though, it was treated as the former. Patients who reported the compulsive bathing were sometimes referred for psychiatric evaluation. The combination of cyclical vomiting, bizarre behavior, and a history of drug use painted a picture that invited stigma. These were not patients who were immediately believed. These were patients who had to fight to be taken seriously in the very rooms designed to help them. Jessica Frey was 26 when her symptoms began. She had been using cannabis daily since she was 19, for anxiety, she says, and for sleep. It worked, for years. And then, without warning or obvious trigger, she began waking up sick. Not hungover sick. Not flu sick. Something deeper, something that felt almost geological in its force, like the illness was coming from her bones. She would spend the early morning hours in the shower, telling herself it was stress, telling herself it would pass. It didn't pass. Over the following 8 months, she visited the emergency room 11 times. She was tested for Crohn's disease. She was tested for gastroparesis, for ulcers, for a rare hormonal condition called pheochromocytoma. She was prescribed anti-nausea medication that helped marginally, then not at all. Not one physician, in 11 visits, asked her about her cannabis use. And she didn't think to mention it, because she had never connected the two. Cannabis was medicine, as far as she understood it. Cannabis was what people with nausea were supposed to take. Jessica's story is not unusual. Across emergency medicine literature, the average time between symptom onset and correct diagnosis of CHS has historically been around 2 years. 2 years of suffering, of invasive testing, of mounting medical debt, of a condition that had a name, had been described in the medical literature since 2004, when Australian physicians Allen, Nicholson, and Bosley published the first formal case series, and yet remained almost entirely absent from clinical training programs in emergency medicine curricula. The 2004 paper was not ignored. It was read. It was cited. But the population it described, heavy, chronic cannabis users experiencing cyclical vomiting, was at that time considered vanishingly rare. And in the pre-legalization landscape, there was a tendency to treat cannabis-related pathology as a fringe concern. Cannabis wasn't like alcohol. Cannabis wasn't like opioids. The cultural and political weight of those substances meant their harms were well documented, well funded, well understood. Cannabis existed in a different category, contested, stigmatized in a different direction, and for many in the medical community, simply not a priority. Then the legal landscape changed. State by state, country by country, cannabis moved from prohibition toward regulation, and use rates climbed sharply. More people using more frequently, using higher potency products than had existed in any previous generation, and the emergency rooms began to see more of these patients. Not a trickle. A wave. Between 2006 and 2014, according to data published in the journal Academic Emergency Medicine, hospital visits coded with cyclic vomiting in states where cannabis had been legalized increased by more than 2.5 times compared to states where it remained illegal. The correlation was striking. Researchers were careful, as researchers must be, not to overstate causation. But the signal was loud enough that it could no longer be dismissed as a fringe concern. And so the question that emergency physicians had been quietly asking among themselves, is this real, is this common, what exactly are we dealing with, began to move into the center of the conversation. Research programs were funded. Surveys were conducted. A condition that had existed in the shadows of clinical medicine for at least 2 decades was finally beginning to receive the serious scientific attention it demanded. But attention, as any scientist will tell you, is only the beginning. Because even now, with more researchers working on CHS than ever before, the most fundamental questions remain stubbornly open. We know the hot shower works. We don't fully know why. We know that stopping cannabis use stops the episodes. We don't know why only some users develop the condition. And we don't know, and this may be the most important question of all, what is happening in the long term to the people who can't, or won't, stop. By the time researchers had mapped the basic contours of Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome, a new and deeply uncomfortable question was beginning to surface. If cannabis was causing this illness, why were so many patients still reaching for it during their worst moments? Why were people who were violently ill, who had been hospitalized multiple times, who had lost weight in relationships and jobs to this relentless cycle of vomiting, why were they still smoking, still consuming, still unable to stop? The answer to that question would force clinicians, scientists, and policymakers to reckon with something the cannabis conversation had long been reluctant to confront, the reality of cannabis use disorder. For decades, cannabis was considered by many to be essentially non-addictive. Unlike heroin or alcohol, it did not produce the dramatic physical withdrawal symptoms that people associated with chemical dependence. This belief was widespread, deeply held, and, it turns out, significantly incomplete. Research now tells us that approximately 9% of people who use cannabis will develop a dependence on it. That number climbs to about 17% for those who begin using in adolescence, and to somewhere between 25 and 50% among daily users. These are not trivial figures. When you apply them to the hundreds of millions of people who use cannabis globally, the scale of the problem becomes impossible to ignore. Cannabis use disorder is characterized by a loss of control over use, persistent cravings, continued use despite negative consequences, and the inability to stop even when stopping is clearly the right thing to do. For CHS patients caught in the prodromal or hypermetic phase, this creates a trap of almost Byzantine cruelty. The cannabis is making them sick. They know it is making them sick. And yet the endocannabinoid system, the very system that cannabis has hijacked, is also deeply involved in regulating nausea and appetite and anxiety. So in the short term, using cannabis again can temporarily blunt the very symptoms it is causing. It is the definition of a vicious cycle, and for some patients, it can take years of repeated hospitalizations before the connection finally becomes undeniable. Dr. Ethan Russo, a neurologist and cannabis researcher who has spent decades studying the endocannabinoid system, has described CHS as a kind of pharmacological paradox, a condition in which the medicine and the poison are the same substance. His work has helped illuminate why the hot shower compulsion, that strange and defining feature of the syndrome, provides even a partial explanation for what is happening in the body. The skin contains its own dense network of cannabinoid receptors. Heat activates a receptor called TRPV1, the same receptor triggered by capsaicin, the active compound in chili peppers. Activating TRPV1 in the skin appears to temporarily redirect blood flow and neurological signaling in ways that compete with the nausea signals originating in the gut. In other words, the hot shower is not a psychological quirk. It is the body instinctively seeking a physiological countermeasure. It is finding, through trial and error, a way to temporarily override a broken feedback loop. This insight about TRPV1 led to a treatment development that many emergency physicians now consider one of the most significant practical advances in managing CHS. Capsaicin cream, applied topically to the abdomen, has shown considerable promise in reducing the severity of CHS symptoms. Multiple clinical reports and small studies have documented patients whose vomiting decreased significantly within hours of capsaicin application. It is not a cure. Nothing short of stopping cannabis use has ever been shown to be a cure. But as a tool for managing acute episodes, capsaicin cream has become a meaningful part of the CHS treatment conversation, and its success is itself a kind of confirmation of the TRPV1 hypothesis. The mechanism that makes hot showers soothing is the same mechanism that capsaicin exploits. The body, it turns out, had been pointing toward the answer all along. Yet even as the science was advancing, the social and legal landscape was shifting beneath it in ways that complicated the picture enormously. State after state in the United States began legalizing cannabis for recreational use. Countries across Europe and the Americas expanded access. The global cannabis market, estimated at well over $30 billion annually, was growing at a pace that made clear this was no longer a fringe substance. It was a mainstream consumer product, marketed with the sophistication of the alcohol and wellness industries, packaged in gummies and tinctures and vaping cartridges, sold in sleek dispensaries with knowledgeable staff and loyalty programs. And yet almost none of these products came with any warning about CHS. The potency issue became increasingly urgent in this context. The cannabis of the 1970s, the substance on which most of the early safety assumptions were built, had average THC concentrations of around 2 to 3%. Today's commercially available cannabis regularly exceeds 25 to 30% THC. Concentrates, waxes, and dabs can reach 90%. The endocannabinoid system was never designed to handle this kind of chemical bombardment. Researchers studying receptor downregulation, the process by which the brain reduces its sensitivity to a repeatedly stimulated receptor, believe that chronic, high-dose THC exposure fundamentally alters how the hypothalamus and gut communicate. CHS may be, at its core, the end result of years of accumulated neurological change. The brain rewiring itself, and losing, in the process, its ability to keep the stomach calm. The implications for prevention are stark. If CHS is at least partly a function of cumulative exposure and concentration, then the explosion in high-potency products represents a looming public health challenge that regulators are only beginning to grapple with. Some researchers have called for THC concentration caps on legal cannabis products. Others have advocated for mandatory labeling that includes explicit CHS warnings. The cannabis industry has largely resisted both. Patient advocacy groups, many of them composed of CHS survivors and their families, have grown louder in demanding that this illness be taken seriously at a policy level. Their stories are consistent and heartbreaking: years of misdiagnosis, thousands of dollars in medical bills, relationships strained to breaking, careers interrupted, and always, at the center of it, a condition that could have been identified and addressed far earlier if only more people had known it existed. One of those advocates is a woman named Rachel, who spent 4 years being treated for cyclic vomiting syndrome before a gastroenterologist, almost as an afterthought, asked about her cannabis use. She had been using daily for stress relief since college. She had never once thought it might be connected to her illness. When she stopped, the vomiting stopped. It took 6 weeks, and she describes that period as one of the hardest of her life, not because of dramatic withdrawal, but because cannabis had become so woven into the fabric of her daily functioning that she did not know who she was without it. She is now a vocal advocate, speaking at medical conferences and patient support groups, telling her story so that others do not spend 4 years searching for an answer that was hiding in plain sight. Rachel's story, and the thousands of stories like hers, remind us that behind every case study, every receptor diagram, every clinical trial, there is a human being trying to understand why their body has turned against them. Medicine has a long history of dismissing conditions it does not yet understand, of labeling patients as anxious or attention-seeking or psychosomatic, of reaching for familiar diagnoses when unfamiliar ones are needed. CHS suffered from exactly this pattern for years. The hot shower clue was there. The cannabis history was there. The cyclical nature of the illness was there. But without a framework to hold those observations together, they remained invisible. That framework now exists. It is incomplete, and it is still being built, but it exists. The physicians who are emerging from medical schools today are being taught about CHS in ways their predecessors never were. Emergency departments are developing protocols. Researchers are running trials. Patients are finding answers faster. The mystery, if not fully solved, is at least being taken seriously, and in medicine, that shift in seriousness is often where healing begins. There is something almost elegiac about the story of Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome. It is a condition born at the intersection of human biology and human behavior, of ancient plant chemistry and modern consumption habits, of a substance that has been used for thousands of years suddenly being consumed in ways and quantities that our bodies were never prepared to manage. It is a story about what happens when something familiar becomes something new without anyone noticing the change. And it is a story about medicine doing what medicine, at its best, always does, following the evidence wherever it leads, even when that path winds through cold hospital corridors, steaming shower stalls, and the long, difficult work of listening to patients who have been told, for too long, that their suffering does not make sense. It makes sense now. And that, after years of confusion and misdiagnosis and unnecessary pain, is where we must begin. Join us soon for another documentary.